Chapter 3 of A Diamond Sky Above Titanic, a Good Omens fanfiction, written by SeaBlueEyes, read aloud by SkyAsimaru. If you enjoy this podfic, you can check out the original story on Archive of Our Own. If you would like to hear more of my recordings or see some of my own work, you can find me through the pen and screen name of SkyAsimaru. A Diamond Sky Above Titanic, Chapter 3, A Recommencement. Crowley had been planning on staying on good terms with Bruce Ismay after he left White Star Line, if only to get a lifetime's free tickets for any future cruises. A human's, that is, not a demon's. However, at the end of the third day on board, after 3 days of endlessly greeting affluent clients, of dining with different yet invariably airheaded people each meal, of being proudly exhibited by Ismay as his enigmatic young adviser, like some kind of bloody pedigree poodle, of being constantly surrounded by inconsequential chatter, of having not been able to sneak away to see his angel even once, Crowley was starting to remember again why he never hung around one human for too long. He was, he supposed, enjoying himself. He'd mused aloud around Ismay how nice it would be for the company if Titanic could be coaxed into going just that little bit faster and arrive Tuesday night instead of Wednesday. He'd instilled a little pride and shameless self-interest in good old Captain E.J. when Ismay had relayed Crowley's ideas to him.
The Titanic must make headlines!
To sway the seamen into pushing the engines, all in preparation for the major coal shortage Crowley would cause next week that would leave them having to be towed into New York a full week behind schedule. He'd caused a mild panic as they left port by untying the little New York boat from her moorings and sending her drifting their way. He'd hidden the lookout's binoculars and sent poor 5th Officer Harold Lowe on a goose chase for them. He'd even, when he'd been feeling particularly bored and unoriginal, had a banana peel slither across the floor to position itself right beneath the foot of an unsuspecting waiter. These minor devilries had all been hugely entertaining, but, in general, with the company he was forced to keep, he was just no longer enjoying himself. Free tickets be damned! He'd had enough of this. And so, on April 13th, 2 days after they'd left Queenstown and the English Channel behind, he had got up ridiculously early, before anyone else could be around to intercept him, and snaked his way over to Aziraphale's rooms. The angel hadn't been sleeping. Some day Crowley was going to have to teach him that pleasure of the world. So, despite the early hour, they had strolled over to the deserted Café Parisien on the promenade deck, bagged themselves the best table with a view, and promptly ordered breakfast. They had languidly dined on the finest continental croissants with Oxford marmalade for Crowley, and Philadelphia cheese scones with cranberries for Aziraphale. despite the perplexed baker having only put in a batch of sultana ones that morning. Accompanied, of course, by Earl Grey tea and freshly squeezed oranges all the way from Sicily. They took their time, just an angel and a demon, on the Titanic, catching up on a century spent apart. Wars and revolutions, inventions and innovations, architecture and archaeometry, pop music and popcorn. There was much to be discussed and debated. That had been 5 o'clock. By 9, the place had filled up too much to comfortably chat about ineffability and omniscience, and whose side had coined instant coffee. So they had gone for a walk around the perimeter of the ship, which they ended up doing a further 3 times. On the 4th, they ran into Thomas Andrews, the master shipbuilder, who had been writing something down in that omnipresent notebook of his. Crowley heard Aziraphale suck in a breath next to him, and mentally groaned. Any time the demon had made the mistake of bringing the man up in their conversations, Aziraphale would just go on and on and on in a massive soliloquy about his kindness and selflessness and thoughtfulness and pureness of spirit and pureness of heart. It was sickening. A good afternoon to you, Mr. Crowley, smiled Andrews to him, with that pleasant Irish accent of his, customarily tipping his hat to him. Thomas Andrews was a handsome, broad-shouldered man, somewhere in his late 40s. He seemed, much to Crowley's annoyance, to be perpetually cheerful, never without a pleasant smile or a heartfelt word, even though the 2 of them didn't so much see eye to eye as eye to foot. He'd proved impossible to tempt. Had he been born a millennium or 2 earlier, Crowley had always privately thought, the man would probably have been made a saint.
Hi, Thomas,
returned Crowley, decidedly uncomfortably, touching his own hat as he hid a frown. His skin always felt vaguely tingly, being in close proximity to such a good soul. Beside him, Aziraphale was practically basking in the same effect. Crowley stared at him. Then he pulled himself together.
Thomas, have you had the pleasure of meeting my old friend and associate, Aziraphale?
Andrews smiled warmly at the angel and extended his notebook-free hand. How do you do, Mr. Phil? Whatever must he write about in that little book of his? Wouldn't it be awful if it fell into the wrong hands? Aziraphale beamed, blushing, shaking the shipbuilder's hand with more vigor than was strictly necessary. It is a pleasure, Mr. Andrews, an absolute pleasure. I am such an avid enthusiast of your work. I have been following your endeavours with much interest. You have a fine talent, my dear sir. Truly, the Titanic is a credit to you. You must be terribly proud. A touch of pink brightened Mr. Andrews' cheeks as he looked down with a modest smile. Thank you kindly, Mr. Phil. It does my heart good to hear she's appreciated. Oh, she is a work of art, Mr. Andrews. And now they were talking over the top of him. Well, that was just peachy then, thought Crowley jealously. If Aziraphale wanted to go have some private time with dear Andrews, then Crowley might as well bugger off and seduce Ismay. God only knew the dirty bastard had been harboring some seriously twisted fantasies about him for some time now. He suppressed a shudder.
Okay, then,
said Crowley loudly, over the laugh the couple was now sharing.
I'll just be off then, shall I?
Crowley?
Aziraphale was looking at him somewhat oddly, or rather like he was somewhat odd. The angel turned back to Andrews.
I suppose we had better be off, actually. It was lovely talking with you, Mr. Andrews. I do hope to see more of you at dinner.
And to you too, Mr. Fell. Andrews smiled from one to the other.
Mr. Crowley?
Crowley returned his blandly. As soon as the shipbuilder was out of earshot, Aziraphale rounded on the demon.
Whatever has got into you, Crowley? You were ever so rude to the poor gentleman.
Crowley glared back, then, taking the bull by the horns.
Do you mean to tell me you fancy Thomas Andrews, Aziraphale?
Keep your voice down,
the angel hissed, mortified.
You silly old snake! What on earth gave you that ridiculous notion?
Crowley just raised his eyebrows above his dark glasses.
Crowley,
Aziraphale said sharply.
I'm an angel.
So?
So? It's just wrong. He's a human. My role is but to guide and inspire and...
Wait.
Crowley held up a hand. He stared seriously at the angel, stopped walking to do so.
By that philosophy, are you telling me you've never...
He twisted his long, pale hands through the air expressively as he sought the right verb.
Been with a human?
Aziraphale stared back, his eyebrows lowered in puzzlement.
Been what with a human?
You know, like, been with them, biblically.
Crowley tried again. Then, with an exasperated sigh,
Romantically?
Oh!
Aziraphale looked a little sheepish. He gazed across the railings that they found themselves canted against, taking in the shimmering ocean stretched as far as even their inhuman eyes could see. It was pinking in hue now, the late afternoon ripening to evening.
Well, to an extent, yes.
To an extent?
The angel gave his companion a withering look.
Obviously not to the extent your unholy demonic tongue is insinuating, he said haughtily. My friends were in need of comfort, and I delivered it.
There was a wicked humor in Crowley's smirk.
So what? Your extent is a hug?
Aziraphale shot him a sidelong look, but he had to turn to hide his own smile.
I wouldn't expect you to understand, dear. No, I have never had sexual intercourse with a human being. Lust is a sin.
Yeah, well, so's gluttony. But as I do recall, you scoffed 4 of those little scone things this morning.
Oh, they were miniature.
And we're never hungry, even, to begin with.
Aziraphale was in no position to argue the point.
All right, then, he said, slightly miffed. "We seem to have digressed somewhat. What was it you were saying before?" Crowley tilted his head, stared out into the hanging orb of the sun, not quite setting. "Evidently nothing of importance, then," said Aziraphale hurriedly, having remembered. Crowley opened his mouth to speak, but whatever he was about to say was driven from his head by what sounded like the fanfare that precedes the arrival of a king, being performed by a trumpet barely 2 meters away. Crowley hissed in pain, he and the angel both covering their ears as the announcement for dinner continued.
Yeah,
he said angrily, summing up both their feelings.
"Bloody idiot! That was my idea too."
"What? To deafen everyone?"
"No, to majorly piss them off."
Crowley turned to glare at the trumpet's player, who had finished his little solo and looked all pleased with himself. Then he sighed, deeply and dramatically.
"Ugh, I could really do without dinner tonight. It is just yak, yak, yak from all sides. You can't escape it. You wouldn't believe how dim-witted the upper crust of upper-class society is. Or maybe you would. You're a first-classer yourself, after all."
Aziraphale ummed agreeably, deciding not to mention the 1671 edition of Paradise Regained he'd had to part with in order to procure his ticket on board. He could have got twice as much for his first edition of Paradise Lost, but couldn't bear to part with it. John Milton had given it to him, free of charge, as a thank you for all of Aziraphale's helpful inputs along the way. Crowley appeared to brighten a little. The characteristic spark of mischief had returned to his face.
"Say, fancy coming back to my suites instead, ordering room service, and getting totally and utterly sozzled."
"Mr. Crowley,"
said a sharp voice behind him.
"Where have you been all day? I've had my men look for you."
Ismay, standing behind Crowley, didn't see the demon's face wrinkle up into an expression of deep resignation. Aziraphale almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Crowley raised his eyebrows at his friend, then turned around in a quick, elegant spin that flared the tails of his frock coat out, and smiled lazily.
"Bruce! Hi! How's it going?"
Ismay was not looking pleased. His ridiculous mustache bristled as he sniffed haughtily.
"Mr. Crowley, as an employee under my name and a representative to White Star Line, in future I would expect you—"
Seeing that Crowley had opened his mouth, no doubt to say something irreverent that would only dig himself in deeper, Aziraphale came to stand beside him and smoothly interrupted the managing director. "Mr. Ismay, I do apologize, but it is I who is responsible for dear Crowley's absence all day," he said graciously. He cast a quick glance at his friend, then went on. "I asked for a tour of the ship this morning at lunch, and I'm afraid we became rather distracted and lost track of the time. I'm awfully sorry if this was in any way an inconvenience to you." Ismay was looking at him somewhat disdainfully, but appeared mollified.
Yes, Fell, is it?"
"That is correct, Mr. Ismay."
"Yes, well..."
Now he turned back to Crowley.
I'll see you at dinner then, Crowley.
He touched his hat politely to Aziraphale.
Mr. Fell?
Mr. Ismay. Aziraphale returned the gesture. Ismay left. As soon as he was gone, Crowley turned to the angel.
Hi. Fancy joining me for dinner with my little pals instead?
Aziraphale's brows rose in surprise. You're inviting me to join the upper crust of the upper class?
It's nothing personal, you understand.
Crowley was smiling snakishly.
You don't have to, if you don't want to,
he added quickly, showing his palms in the universal "no worries, it's cool" sign.
But, well, what with Thomas Andrews joining us tonight, I thought you might...
Oh, well, if Thomas Andrews is coming, then of course I'll join you, Aziraphale joked, humouring his friend. Gosh, what company I'll be in. Yes, of course I'll join you, my boy. Shall we arrange a time and a place to meet up? Crowley named them. They grinned at each other and turned to head to their respective rooms to dress.
Oh, and Aziraphale.
Aziraphale turned round at the top of the stairs leading to sea deck. Yes, Crowley? Crowley's grin widened teasingly.
Manifest an omega or something, would you?
Aziraphale laughed in bemusement. Why? And what in heaven and earth is an omega?
It's a watch, Angel,
said Crowley amusedly.
A good one. They live and breathe money, these people. So just act like you're into that stuff and you'll fit right in.
He grinned again at the angel, and, standing there, silhouetted against the now setting sun, with that sharp, toothy smile, hands on his hips, wearing an expression of fond exasperation on his pale, handsome face, there was something iconic about him. Aziraphale smiled at his friend, and, turning the hand he was using to shield his eyes from the sun into a salute, he brought it down like a private to his sergeant. I'll do my best, dear Crowley, he smiled. Crowley smiled back. Then they both turned their different ways and prepared for the ordeal that would be the high table in a first-class dinner. To be continued in Chapter 4. Thank you for reading. Please drop by the archive and let the author know what you thought of their work.